Thanks for joining us again for our video blog series called Ask Marco. This is episode 3. Again, I'll start with a quick shout out, this time to the lady behind the scenes, my wife, Rosa Pulcinelli, who's given me every good idea I've ever had. That includes this video blog series. Rosa never seeks the limelight, but she's always the one with the great ideas. Thanks, Rosa. So the first question I want to address today concerns the COVID clauses that many of you are seeing in agreements of purchase and sale. So there's a few clauses that have been circulating, and you might be familiar with them. Some of them are quite harmless and pretty self-explanatory. For example, there's a clause that talks about the fact that the balance of the purchase price can be paid with wire instead of certified check. That's actually quite helpful in this environment. The other one requires the parties to accept electronic signatures on the closing documents. And again, we talked about that in the earlier episodes. That's quite helpful. The types of clauses that I get quite a few questions on related to COVID mostly concern the extension clauses. What's important to note is that some of the clauses are quite buyer-friendly and other ones are a little more balanced or even seller-friendly. So this is not to suggest that you shouldn't use the clauses. Many of you have brokers that have selected certain clauses they'd like to see in the agreement, but you should be aware if you're advising your client, particularly if you're on the other side of a transaction where a certain clause has been selected, that your client understand what the implication of that clause is. So the first example I'm going to show you is one that's really buyer friendly. And the reason I say that is because it talks about the fact that if there's any complications with the transaction, that both parties are basically agreeing to extend the transaction. I mean, that's great in principle, but your seller client might have an issue with that if you get to the closing date and the buyer relies on that clause to just extend the transaction. Now, again, it does require both parties to be reasonable, but it does introduce a level of variability with the closing date, and some sellers may have a real problem with that. The second example is a clause that I've seen circulating quite a bit of late. It's quite a bit more balanced. In fact, it's more seller friendly because it enumerates the types of situations that would have to arise before an extension is required. So you can read this clause. The first thing to note is that it doesn't reference complications. It actually references certain circumstances that have to arise before there's an extension. And again, while I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know what the market's going to be doing in a couple of weeks, the types of scenarios that it describes are pretty remote, or at least are not things that you would expect happen unless we're in really dire circumstances. For example, the closing of the land registry office and the closing of all financial institutions would be a seriously dire situation. This clause requires all of those things to happen before there's an extension of the closing date. So again, the point here is simply to understand that there's a few different variations of the extension clause that you're seeing for COVID-related circumstances, and just be aware of that before you simply sign off and have your client sign off on an agreement. The next question I want to address is regarding tenancies. I had a question from an agent who was asking whether their seller client should be providing vacant possession as part of their agreement where they have a tenant. So the problem here is a practical one. I don't actually practice in the area of landlord and tenant law, but from what I understand, everything's really at a standstill right now. The implication is if you're a seller and you're selling a property that has a tenant in it, even if you have a legitimate basis for terminating the tenancy and you provide the necessary notice to the tenant, the reality is that you may not be able to provide vacant possession on closing. And the reason for that is that the landlord-tenant board is not currently operating unless for emergency matters. So the issue is you as landlord and seller could be legally justified in seeking the removal of a tenant, but you're not practically able to enforce that because the board is not operating. So just understand that if you're a seller selling in this environment and providing vacant possession to the buyer and you have a tenant there, you could run into a situation where you can't actually get the tenant out on closing, which would represent a breach of the contract that you signed. Of course, there's a myriad of other issues related to tenancy matters right now, including the fact that how do you even show a property with tenants in it? And can they refuse to allow for visits? Again, the issue is one of enforcement. In regular times, tenants might not be able to refuse a visit, but clearly things have changed now. So again, just be really careful if you're entering into an agreement of purchase and sale where you're the seller and you're trying to provide vacant possession, because you might not be able to. All right, that's a wrap for episode 3. We'll see you soon and stay well.